maybe you could start by talking a little bit about the kind of instruction you got at UCLA. Was it very technical or some mix of film history, film theory, film production?
At that time, it was a very open curriculum. By that I mean it was like the spirit of the times. I went to UCLA from 69 to 72, and for the first 2 years, you were not supposed to take any technical courses at all. We would take film history, art history, anthropology, everything except technical knowledge. And at the end of those 2 years, you were supposed to make a film without knowing anything about technique with your fellow students. And that was called the Project One, which is the one we saw in the beginning. And you made your Project One, and it was shown in a big auditorium where all the whole faculty was and the whole students were there. And about 70% of the people would fail. The 30 that were left would continue. I think the theory behind that type of education there was that you had to have an innate talent for film. Whereas in USC, where I studied, it was more the first year. It was more Hollywood oriented, and you had to know from the beginning if you were going to be a screenwriter, a cinematographer, a sound man, or a screenplay writer. It was very different. In fact, I think that UCLA was very anarchic in its teaching. In fact, when the U.S. invaded Cambodia, as students of the film department voted to go on strike, and we took over the equipment and fired the teachers, and we had a whole semester where we made all these really bad militant films, but it was a good experience to be at that point and having access to the equipment. It was a very free education. So after you did your Project One and you passed, you would take the technical courses.
And then returning to Colombia after finishing your studies here, well, a couple questions, right? One is, it's a country without a lot of, I mean, it's a big importer and consumer of cinema, but not a big tradition of national production. So one part of my question would be your interest in what we see in Maria, right? The search for what there is of Colombian film history, what fragments or traces you can find.
Well, in the beginning of film in Colombia, in the silent period, about 12 features were made. Most of them have disappeared. Only about 3 or 4 survive. Only one survives entirely, or 2.
That's Las Garras de Oro.
Garras de Oro, 80% of it survives, but Bajo el Cielo Antioqueño, about 70 or 80%, and maybe Alma Provinciana is the only one that survives 100%. And when sound came in, the industry disappeared in Colombia, and no films were made until much, much later, when the same man that made Maria made the first sound picture in 1940. And then the first color film was made in about 1954 in Cali as well. Cali was the pioneer of filmmaking. And after that, film disappeared from Cali and also from Colombia. Hardly any films were made except Mexican productions or co-productions made with other countries. And when I returned, there were I would say, like a dozen filmmakers only, and there was no government sponsorship of films. So the only films that were made were advertising films or sponsored documentaries, like the one you saw, the last film we saw. So we had to do very cheap films. The film about the PanAmerican Games was done while I was at UCLA, and it was done with no money at all. And we only shot 1 hour, and the film is almost half an hour long. You have to be very resourceful with the editing and with the. We didn't have sync sound. That's why the camera is always starts on a face. It's in sync, and then it goes down because it would go out of sync. We had to be very inventive to deal with the technical problems. We only started using sync sound in 1977 with Agarrando Pueblo, the film that was shown yesterday or the day before.
So your idea was that you and people like Carlos Mayolo were going to start some kind of local, if not an industry, then some kind of local film scene?
Yes. Beginning with this film about the Pan-American Games, I started a long association with Carlos Mayolo, and we co-directed maybe 6 films, and I edited almost all his films. And we had a film group that was very active from in the 70s and the 80s, and we made many films in those 20 years. Then the group disbanded in 1991 approximately, because again the government retired any funding there was, and film practically disappeared during 10 years. And then another film fund, government film fund, was started in the late middle 80s maybe, or late 80s.
So your group was what they called Collywood?
Yeah, Grupo de Cali or Collywood.
And at the same time, you and members of your group were sort of interested in rescuing what you could of this national film history.
Yes, we were very active cinephiles because we had a film called Cine Club de Cali. That film club was started by famous writer and critic Andrés Caicedo, who is a mythical figure in Colombian literature. He published the most successful novel about youth called Que Viva la Música. He committed suicide the day the novel was published, and now he's a very mythical figure. Then with Caicedo, we also founded a film magazine. So we were very active in active cinephiles, and that made that other people, young people, stimulate other young people to become filmmakers. And I was also the first film teacher in Cali, 1979.
And were you guys in touch with film scenes in other countries, or people that had parallel projects or similar types of interests elsewhere?
Well, through the magazine, we were in touch, and we had subscriptions to all the movie magazines available in English, Spanish, and French. So, but a lot of our education, film education, was from books. We didn't have access to the films, but we would read about the films. That was very important, to read about film. But hardly any films were available, and even Latin American films were not that available in the countries. That has always been a problem with Latin America, is that the films of our neighbors are not shown in our country, and vice versa. It still happens.
But I imagine at some point you started traveling to film festivals in other
Yes,
countries,
yes.
meeting filmmakers, and
Uh-huh.
then were you able to invite them to come and share their work in Cali?
Well, later we got involved with foreign filmmakers. In fact, some of our people of our group worked with Werner Herzog when he made Cobra Verde, which part was made in Colombia. I participated in a German film made in Cartagena, and there was also another film made in Cartagena by German, directed by Fassbinder's producer Dieter Schieder. So we had some contact with other filmmakers as well.
But that would have been, what, in the 80s?
80s,
Yeah.
yes.
Maybe we can open it up for questions from the audience. Um, there's a microphone. Does any, there's a question in the back there. We won't be able to, yeah, we won't be able to hear you otherwise.
So the films we saw this evening were, for lack of a better word, a bit disparate. So I'm curious, from your perspective, if there's a kind of set of themes or concerns that you feel unites them, kind of an undercurrent.
Well, I think the films we saw today, I was still looking for which way my career would go, because I started with the film we saw in the first Acto de Fe, which was an adaptation of a sad story shot in Los Angeles in another language. I started as a fiction filmmaker. Then the second film was a documentary, and then we started dealing with a mixture of documentary and fiction in a film called Agarrando Pueblo, or The Vampires of Poverty. And I've made, well, many films. I've made about 35 films, but only two feature-length fiction films. One, a vampire film, which was the first vampire film made in Colombia, and the other one, a film noir, which was the first film noir in Colombia. We were very interested in genre films because we grew up in the 50s and 60s, and we admired very much the classic Hollywood movies, and of course the New Wave and European cinema of the 60s and 70s. But we were also very interested in B movies and how to adapt genres to a country like Colombia. How a vampire film could be made into a political film based on real facts, or how to make a film noir based on our reality. And but I quit fiction filmmaking in 1999, and since then I've only made documentaries, except one that is a mockumentary, which is called Un Tigre de Papel, paper tiger, not done in 2007.
I was wondering, how have you noticed the role in these films in social political life? How have you noticed that it varies in screenings in America versus screening your films in Colombia?
Well, my first experience with that was showing Oiga Vea, the film about the PanAmerican Games, at the UCLA Film School. The film was shown without any subtitles, so everybody was a little bit dumbfounded. They didn't know what this crazy movie was all about, you know. I don't know how people in the United States see these films. That would be a question I would have for the audience, really, because some things might seem exotic for you that are not exotic for me. And but I've traveled with my films to many countries, doing retrospectives, and I found that people can deal with them and understand them. You know, I've shown my films in faraway countries and different cultures like Japan or Korea, places like that, where hardly anybody knew where Cali was, or even Colombia. You know, or maybe people had little information about what Colombia is. You know, Pablo Escobar or Narcos, those references, no, or coffee. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about the connections for you between Oiga Bea and Agarrando Pueblo, because I think I'm just wondering if by the time you made Agarrando Pueblo, if you were thinking back on the experience of having made Oiga Bea and looking for if it was a response in certain ways.
Yes, I think that Oiga Bea was made very much under the influence of the time we were living, and influenced by the militant films made at that time. Oiga Bea is a counter-informative film because it's a film done since there was this official film being done about the games, which was in 35 feature-length color and a big budget. Ours was a 16 millimeter film, and we didn't have any access to the venues of the game, so we decided to make the film from the point of view of the people that couldn't get in to the games. It's a film about exclusion. No, and I think the most emblematic shot of the film is when you see the diver, and it zooms out, and the people are outside the stadium looking at that. You know, it's a counter-informative film, and in a way, it's a film of denouncement. When we made Agarrando Pueblo, we were more critical. I mean, we had developed. And since we were film critics, we thought that film criticism should be brought to film itself. So Agarrando Pueblo is a film of film criticism. It's a film about film. We distance ourselves to the mainstream leftist films of the moment. Yes, in fact, well, that's a constant thing in my films. The actor of Agarrando Pueblo appears here in a couple of scenes. That's where we spotted that character, and when we wrote the screenplay of Agarrando Pueblo, we thought of that person, and we looked him up. And the same happened after Agarrando Pueblo. We found another one of the characters in the film, and I made a film about him 9 years later of Agarrando Pueblo, because I'm very interested in what happens to my subjects, what happens to people after you film them, you know.
And Mayolo appears in Maria as the filmmaker, right? So
Yes, he originally a film like Agarrando Pueblo, we tried to do it with actors, and it didn't work. So I told Mayolo, you have to play the role, because the actors didn't know how to play the role of a filmmaker, film director, and Mayolo was a film director, and he's a very good actor, I think. So he's in several of my films, and in my vampire film, he's one of the main characters as well. Our films, since we were a group, we worked in each other's films, and sometimes we would change roles. I was mostly an editor, but sometimes I acted in some of the films. Even in Busca de Maria, I play a small role as well.
Yeah, you get that sense, not necessarily of a collective, but of a group where people are helping each other out on different aspects of their production project.
Yes, our group was interdisciplinary. We were not only filmmakers; some were writers, others were still photographers, some were musicians, and we also belonged at one point to a sort of hippie collective called Ciudad Solar, and there were several things that we had in common, especially partying a lot. It was the 80s.
And todo empezó por el fin.
Uh-huh.
Sort of narrate some of that
My
or a version of it.
latest film is the story of this group, of these 2 decades that we worked as a group. It's an autobiographical film. It's a very long film. It's 3 hours, 20 minutes, because it also became a very autobiographical film in that I got very sick during the making of the film, and the film is also like a medical history of myself, and where you're in a near-death experience, you I know it's a cliche to say it, you start seeing your life as a movie that is unwinding, and that's what I felt, you know, and I thought it would be the last film I would make, so I took my time. And people's time.
Are there other questions for Mr. Ospina?
You mentioned passing Casavetes in the previous conversation, and I felt some resonance of that in Acto da Fe. Is that was that someone who was influencing you in a sense? Influence probably is not the word, but relevant to you in that moment when you were exploring?
More than Cassavetes, I was thinking of French films. On the one hand, because it's an adaptation of a French existential story, and I was very influenced by a film called The Fire Within, made by Louis Malle, which is as well as an adaptation of Dieu La Rochelle. And in fact, it's a taxi driver avant la lettre. It's because Taxi Driver came several years after that film, but it has that spirit, you know, an interior monologue and somebody that decides to go and kill indiscriminately, which has been like an American custom in the last 20 years, you know. You have these guys that start going on a rampage, you know. I think in a way that film was inspired also by this guy that went to a tower in a university and started shooting in Texas. And also I thought of a friend of mine who was in the U.S. Army. He was a Colombian. He joined the U.S. Army. Then he deserted and he went back to Cali and was killed in one. He started killing people and he was killed as well. He went a little bit crazy, so it's a film based on several things.
Thank you.
And how did you end up in Los Angeles? And then another question, I had the opportunity to go to dinner with you. What was it like going to movies here when you were a student?
Well, I went to a prep school in Boston for the last 2 years of high school, and when I finished, I had to study something. What I really liked was the movies, but in Colombia there was no future for movies, and nobody went to film school. So I decided to enroll in architecture in USC, but so the shock for my parents wouldn't be that big. And the first day of classes, I changed my major to film. And then I didn't like USC because of what we talked in the beginning. It was too Hollywood oriented and too career oriented. Yes, and my friend who is here, Bill Coker, went to UCLA, and he lived in my neighborhood in USC. And one day he told me, "You want to go to our school and see how it is, UCLA?" And we came to UCLA, and Ronald Reagan, who was the governor, there was a riot. I mean, he couldn't go out of the buildings in UCLA, and then a whole riot started, and a police car was burned, and there was a lot of action, and I said, this is the place I want to be. So I changed to UCLA.
And can you say something about film culture in Los Angeles?
Yes, I have, for one thing, one great thing at UCLA was that Mellest Hall, there were movies every day, all the time, and you could go to other people's classes. So instead of going to other classes, I would go to other people's classes where they were seeing films. And we had, there was an experimental film course where we saw all the American underground films, and there were courses of European films, courses in documentary, and of course there were the repertory houses, which I used to frequent, especially the Los Feliz Theater. They tell me that it's still going on, the Newark Theater. And of course we had the theaters here in Westwood, which still exist, and within the school there would be like film collectives or cine clubs, and I used to do that a lot. I didn't do a lot of studying. I mostly learned from watching films and reading about films.
And can we assume that the Bombardeo de Washington was inspired by a Bruce Conner film?
Of course. For me, seeing the films of Bruce Conner was like an epiphany, because it was the first time that I saw a film made entirely with archive material. And that's one direction that my films have taken in the last decade. They're mostly made out of archive material. And for me, watching a movie by Bruce Conner was really something that had a big impact on me, as well as seeing the films of Kenneth Anger, for example, and seeing the American underground films, and of course Cassavetes, because he was from LA, and for me watching films like Faces were really something that really changed my mind. Cassavetes is the great influence on the great American filmmakers that came in the 60s, like Scorsese, Mean Streets couldn't exist if Cassavetes hadn't existed. He for me is a major figure and an example to follow, because he was so independent. He almost made whole movies. He would shoot the films with his wife in his house and with his money, and he acted in all these bad movies just to get money.
So it sounds like it must have been a real shock moving back to Cali from all this film culture and
Yes,
opportunities to see?
that's why I joined the Cine Club, because that way we could show the films that were available. Uh, but uh, but what was interesting in the 70s was that the films of the new wave and of the great masters were commercial releases, even in a country like Colombia. You could see in 1 year you could see the latest Buñuel, the latest Bergman, Antonioni, Visconti, Kurosawa. All these films were shown commercially. It was, and they would have a lot of audience, which is unthinkable. For example, I saw the Gato Pardo, the leopard Visconti, and Sunday in the biggest movie house in Cali, and there were 1,000 people watching it. That's unheard of now. Even in a big city, you can't get 1,000 persons to see El Gato Pardo. No. And when we had the film club, we had to, at that time there were first release circuits, and then it would go to second release, double feature, and our objective was to show these films before they would be destroyed, because after 7 years the prints were burned. So our job was to circulate these films before they would be pulled out of release, of
Because the
distribution.
distributors assumed that there was no commercial value for the film after it.
Yes, I think it was the arrangement with the other distribution companies from outside, from every country. It was like a law, you can't exploit a film more than 7 years. And another source of good films was through the embassies, especially the French embassy and the German embassy. We could see the films of Fassbinder in the 80s, the films of Herzog, thanks to the Goethe Institute, or the German embassy, and of course the French New Wave, and the classic French films from the French embassy and Alliance Française.
And other Latin American films? Did you have?
That was more difficult to see, Latin American films. But there was an exception. There were these nuns, Paulistas, Paulist nuns, who had a small distribution company, and they would distribute revolutionary Latin American films. So that's the way we got to see the films of San Ginés and some Cuban films. And of course, the countries from the Eastern Bloc, like East Germany, would circulate films, and of course, there was a distributor of Soviet films. But it was very difficult to see Latin American films. I mean, Glauber Rocha's films arrived very late in Colombia, but we knew all about these films from reading about them. I have a very strange anecdote regarding that. La Hora de los Hornos, the hour of the furnaces of Solanas and Getino, which was supposed to be like the most important militant Latin American film. I saw it here in UCLA after many years, and but I had a lot of information that I had read about it in Mayolo as well, and at that time there wasn't any Betamax or VHS, so what I did was I recorded the soundtrack of the film, and I took the soundtrack and open reel magnetic tape, and I explained the film to Mayolo, like the Japanese people that Benshi tradition. And so I would say, in this scene, we will hear the soundtrack. América Latina es un continente en guerra, and I would say, here you see all these torches and very fast editing, and I went through the whole film explaining it to him.
It's almost as good as the real thing.
Yeah.
Are there other additional questions? Luciano.
Thanks, Luis. A very open and personal question. How was the experience of watching these films again here and coming back here and confronting yourself to the Luis of the 70s?
Well, to use the title of one of my favorite films, it's Out of the Past. No, watching a film I made 47 years ago in UCLA, where I made that film. Well, I mean, for me, that has been a good experience. You know, it's like going back in time. Yesterday, for example, a friend took me out to go to all the places that I frequented, and I started taking photographs, you know. It's been a good experience, you know. It's like, I always wanted to show my films in UCLA. It took a long time, but thanks to you guys, it finally happened, you know. And one thing is that the student films at UCLA were never collected, of that period were never in the collection of the UCLA Film Archive, because the Regents had this policy that they wouldn't finance the films or archive them, because there were very political times. It was the time of Angela Davis on campus and all this. So that is a whole black hole in the archive of UCLA, whereas in other schools, USC, NYU, they collected the films of the students. In fact, today I had lunch with Chris Horak, who is the head of the UCLA archive, and they're in the process of retrieving some of those films and looking for the filmmakers, because it was a very important time in LA filmmaking. This was the time of the LA Rebellion films, you know, and many very good militant films. There were films made about the Black Panthers, the Chicago
Oratorium.
Yeah, the Chicago Convention. Yeah. There were films made by Japanese Americans, by Ethiopians, you know, by Latin Americans. You know. It was a good time to be in LA at that time. I mean, 69 to 72, everything was happening in California.
So the university is now trying to recuperate some
Yeah.
of that institutional history. It's interesting. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Tomorrow afternoon, we'll be back. At 2 o'clock, we're presenting the catalog for this film series that Adam Hyman mentioned at the beginning. And at 3 o'clock, we have a film program that goes along, that accompanies the book presentation. And Jimena Cuevas, Luis Ospina, Luciano Piazza will all be back in the afternoon, and then another program in the evening that concludes our weekend here. So thank you for coming, and come back tomorrow.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to share my work with